It's Tuesday, it's midnight, and you're listening to Abstract Passages with Ben. The thing's hollow. It goes on forever. And, oh my God, it's full of stars. The Stargate opened, the Stargate closed. In a moment of time too short to be measured, space turned and twisted upon itself. Then Japetus was alone once more, as it had been for 3 million years. Alone, except for a deserted but not yet derelict ship, sending back to its makers messages which they could neither believe nor understand. There was no sense of motion, but he was falling toward those impossible stars, shining there in the dark heart of a moon. No, that was not where they really were. He felt certain. He wished, now that it was far too late, that he had paid more attention to those theories of hyperspace, of transdimensional ducts. To David Bowman, they were theories no longer. Perhaps that monolith on Japetus was hollow. Perhaps the roof was only an illusion, or some kind of diaphragm that had opened to let him through. But into what? As far as he could trust his senses, he appeared to be dropping vertically down a huge rectangular shaft, several thousand feet deep. He was moving faster and faster, but the far end never changed its size, and remained always at the same distance from him. Only the stars moved, at first so slowly that it was some time before he realized that they were escaping out of the frame that held him. But in a little while it was obvious that the star field was expanding, as if it was rushing toward him at an inconceivable speed. The expansion was non-linear. The stars at the center hardly seemed to move, while those toward the edge accelerated more and more swiftly until they became streaks of light just before they vanished from view. There were always others to replace them, flowering into the center of the field from an apparently inexhaustible source. Bowman wondered what would happen if a star came straight toward him. Would it continue to expand until he plunged directly into the face of a sun? But not one came near enough to show a disk. Eventually they all veered aside and streaked over the edge of their rectangular frame. And still the far end of the shaft came no closer. It was almost as if the walls were moving with him, carrying him to his unknown destination. Or perhaps he was really motionless, and space was moving past him. Not only space, he suddenly realized, was involved in whatever was happening to him now. The clock on the pod's small instrument panel was also behaving strangely. Normally, the numbers in the tenths of a second window flickered past so quickly that it was almost impossible to read them. Now they were appearing and disappearing at discrete intervals, and he could count them off one by one without difficulty. The seconds themselves were passing with incredible slowness, as if time itself were coming to a stop. At last, the tenth of a second counter froze between 5 and 6. Yet he could still think, and even observe, as the ebon walls flowed past at a speed that might have been anything between 0 and 1,000,000 times the velocity of light. Somehow, he was not in the least surprised, nor was he alarmed. On the contrary, he felt a sense of calm expectation, such as he had once known when the space medics had tested him with hallucinogenic drugs. The world around him was strange and wonderful, but there was nothing to fear. He had traveled these millions of miles in search of mystery, and now it seemed the mystery was coming to him. The rectangle ahead was growing lighter. The luminous star streaks were paling against a milky sky, whose brilliance increased moment by moment. It seemed as if the space pod was heading toward a bank of cloud, uniformly illuminated by the rays of an invisible sun. He was emerging from the tunnel. The far end, which until now had remained at the same indeterminate distance, neither approaching nor receding, had suddenly started to obey the normal laws of perspective. It was coming closer and steadily widening before him. At the same time, he felt that he was moving upward, and for a fleeting instant, he wondered if he had fallen right through Japetus, and was now ascending from the other side. But even before the space pod soared out into the open, he knew that his place had nothing to do with Japetus, or with any world within the experience of man. There was no atmosphere, for he could see all details unblurred, clear right down to an incredibly remote and flat horizon. He must be above a world of enormous size, perhaps one much larger than Earth. Yet despite its extent, all the surface that Bowman could see was tessellated into obviously artificial patterns that must have been miles on a side. It was like the jigsaw puzzle of a giant that played with planets, and at the centers of many of those squares and triangles and polygons were gaping black shafts, twins of the chasm from which he had just emerged. Yet the sky above was stranger, and in its way more disturbing, than even the improbable land beneath. For there were no stars, neither was there the blackness of space. There was only a softly glowing milkiness that gave the impression of infinite distance. Bowman remembered a description he had once heard of the dreaded Antarctic whiteout, like being inside a ping-pong ball. Those words could be applied perfectly to this weird place, but the explanation must be totally different. The sky could be no meteorological effect of mist and snow. There was a perfect vacuum here. Then, as Bowman's eyes grew accustomed to the nacreous glow that filled the heavens, he became aware of another detail. The sky was not, as he had thought at first glance, completely empty. Dotted overhead, quite motionless and forming apparently random patterns, were myriads of tiny black specks. They were difficult to see, for they were mere points of darkness. But once detected, they were quite unmistakable. They reminded Bowman of something so familiar, yet so insane, that he refused to accept the parallel until logic forced it upon him. Those black holes in the white sky were stars. He might have been looking at a photographic negative of the Milky Way. Where in God's name am I? Bowman asked himself, and even as he posed the question, he felt certain that he could never know the answer. It seemed that space had been turned inside out. This was not a place for man. Though the capsule was comfortably warm, he felt suddenly cold, and was afflicted by an almost uncontrollable trembling. He wanted to close his eyes and shut out the pearly nothingness that surrounded him, but that was the act of a coward, and he would not yield to it. The pierced and faceted planet slowly rolled beneath him without any real change of scenery. He guessed that he was about 10 miles above the surface, and should be able to see any signs of life with ease. But this whole world was deserted. Intelligence had come here, worked its will upon it, and gone its way again. Then he noticed, humped above the flat plain perhaps 20 miles away, a roughly cylindrical pile of debris that could only be the carcass of a gigantic ship. It was too distant for him to see any details, and it passed out of sight within a few seconds, but he could make out broken ribs and dully gleaming sheets of metal that had been partly peeled off like the skin of an orange. He wondered how many thousands of years the wreck had lain here on this deserted checkerboard, and what manner of creatures had sailed it between the stars. Then he forgot the derelict, for something was coming up over the horizon. At first it looked like a flat disk, but that was because it was heading almost directly toward him. As it approached and passed beneath, he saw that it was spindle-shaped and several hundred feet long. Though there were faintly visible bands here and there along its path, it was hard to focus upon them, The object appeared to be vibrating, or perhaps spinning, at a very rapid rate. It tapered to a point at either end, and there was no sign of propulsion. Only one thing about it was familiar to human eyes, and that was its color. If it was indeed a solid artifact, it was not an optical phantom. Then its makers perhaps shared some of the emotions of men, but they certainly did not share their limitations, for the spindle appeared to be made of gold. Bowman moved his head to the rear view system to watch the thing drop behind. It had ignored him completely, and now he saw that it was falling out of the sky down toward one of the thousands of great slots. A few seconds later, it disappeared in a final dash of gold as it dived into the planet. He was alone again, beneath that sinister sky, and the sense of isolation and remoteness was more overwhelming than ever. Then he saw that he also was sinking down toward the mottled surface of the giant world, and that another of the rectangular chasms yawned immediately below. The empty sky closed above him, the clock crawled to rest, and once again his pod was falling between infinite ebon walls, toward another distant patch of stars. But now he was sure that he was not returning to the solar system, and in a flash of insight that might have been wholly spurious, he knew what this thing must surely be. It was some kind of cosmic switching device, routing the traffic of the stars through unimaginable dimensions of space and time. He was passing through a grand central station of the galaxy. Far ahead, the walls of the slot were becoming dimly visible once more, in the faint light diffusing downward from some still hidden source. And then the darkness was abruptly whipped away as the tiny space pod hurtled upward into a sky ablaze with stars. He was back in space as he knew it, but a single glance told him that he was light centuries from Earth. He did not even attempt to find any of the familiar constellations that since the beginning of history had been the friends of man. Perhaps none of the stars now blazed around him had ever been seen by the unaided human eye. Most of them were concentrated in a glowing belt, broken here and there with dark bands of obscuring cosmic dust which completely circled the sky. It was like the Milky Way, but scores of times brighter. Bowman wondered if this was indeed his own galaxy, seen from a point much closer to its brilliant, crowded center. He hoped that it was, that he would not be so far from home. But this, he realized at once, was a childish thought. He was so inconceivably remote from the solar system that it made little difference whether he was in his own galaxy or the most distant one that any telescope had ever glimpsed. He looked back to see the thing from which he was rising, and had another shock. Here was no giant multifaceted world, nor any duplicate of Japetus. There was nothing, except an inky shadow against the stars, like a doorway opening from a darkened room into a still darker night. Even as he watched, that doorway closed. It did not recede from him. It slowly filled with stars, as if a rent in the fabric of space had been repaired. Then he was alone beneath the alien sky. The space pod was slowly turning, and as it did so, it brought fresh wonders into view. First, there was a perfectly spherical swarm of stars, becoming more and more closely packed toward the center until its heart was a continuous glow of light. Its outer edges were ill-defined, a slowly thinning halo of suns that merged imperceptibly into the background of more distant stars. This glorious apparition, Bowman knew, was a globular cluster. He was looking upon something that no human eye had ever seen, save as a smudge of light in the field of a telescope. He could not remember the distance to the nearest known cluster, but he was sure that there was none within 1,000 light years of the solar system. The pod continued its slow rotation to disclose an even stranger sight, a huge red sun, many times larger than the moon is seen from Earth. Bowman could look straight into its face without discomfort. Judging by its color, it was no hotter than a glowing coal. Here and there, set into the somber red, were rivers of bright yellow, incandescent Amazons, meandering for thousands of miles before they lost themselves in the deserts of this dying sun. Dying? No. That was a wholly false impression, born of human experience and the emotions aroused by the hues of sunset or the glow of fading embers. This was a star that had left behind the fiery extravagances of its youth, had raced through the violets and blues and greens of the spectrum in a few fleeting billions of years, and now had settled down to a peaceful maturity of unimaginable length. All that had gone before was not a thousandth of what was yet to come. The story of this star had only just begun. The pod had ceased to roll. The great red sun lay straight ahead. Though there was no sense of motion, Bowman knew that he was still gripped by whatever controlling force had brought him here from Saturn. All the science and engineering skill of Earth seemed hopelessly primitive now, against the powers that were carrying him to some unimaginable fate. He stared into the sky ahead, trying to pick out the goal toward which he was being taken. Perhaps some planet circling the great sun. But there was nothing that showed any visible disk or exceptional brightness. If there were planets orbiting here, he could not distinguish them from the stellar background. Then he noticed that something strange was happening on the very edge of the sun's crimson disk. A white glow had appeared there and was rapidly waxing in brilliance. He wondered if he was seeing one of those sudden eruptions or flares that trouble most stars from time to time. The light became brighter and brighter. It began to spread along the edge of the sun, whose blood-red hues paled swiftly by comparison. It was almost, Bowman told himself, smiling at the absurdity of the thought, as if he were watching sunrise on a sun. And so indeed he was. Above the burning horizon lifted something no larger than a star, but so brilliant that the eye could not bear to look upon it. A mere point of blue-white radiance, like an electric arc, was moving at unbelievable speed across the face of the great sun. It must be very close to its giant companion, for immediately below it, drawn upward by its gravitational pull, was a column of flame thousands of miles high. It was as if a tidal wave of fire was marching forever along the equator of this star, in vain pursuit of the searing apparition in its sky. That pinpoint of incandescence must be a white dwarf, one of those strange, fierce little stars, no larger than the Earth, yet containing 1,000,000 times its mass. Some ill-matched stellar couples were not uncommon, but Bowman had never dreamed that one day he would see such a pair with his own eyes. The white dwarf had transited almost half the disk of its companion. It must take only minutes to make a complete orbit. When Bowman was at last certain that he too was moving. Ahead of him, one of the stars was becoming rapidly brighter and was beginning to drift against its background. It must be some small, close body, perhaps the world toward which he was traveling. It was upon him with unexpected speed, and he saw that it was not a world at all. A dully gleaming cobweb, or latticework of metal, hundreds of miles in extent, grew out of nowhere until it filled the sky. Scattered across its continent-wide surface were structures that must have been as large as cities, but which appeared to be machines. Around many of these were assembled scores of smaller objects, ranged in neat rows and columns. Bowman had passed several such groups before he realized that they were fleets of spaceships. He was flying over a gigantic orbital parking lot. Because there were no familiar objects by which he could judge the scale of the scene flashing by below, It was almost impossible to estimate the size of the vessels hanging there in space, but they were certainly enormous. Some must have been miles at length. They were of many different designs: spheres, faceted crystals, slim pencils, ovoids, discs. This must be one of the meeting places for the commerce of the stars. Or it had been, perhaps 1,000,000 years ago, for nowhere could Bowman see any sign of activity. The sprawling spaceport was as dead as the moon. He knew it not only by the absence of all movement, but by such unmistakable signs as great gaps torn in the metal cobweb by the wasp-like blundering of asteroids that must have smashed through it eons ago. This was no longer a parking lot. It was a cosmic junk heap. He had missed its builders by ages, and with that realization, Bowman felt a sudden sinking of his heart. Though he had not known what to expect, at least he had hoped to meet some intelligence from the stars. Now it seemed he was too late. He had been caught in an ancient automatic trap, set for some unknown purpose, and still operating when its makers had long since passed away. It had swept him across the galaxy and dumped him, with how many others, in the celestial Sargasso, doomed soon to die when his air was exhausted. Well, it was unreasonable to expect more. Already, he had seen wonders for which many men would have sacrificed their lives. He thought of his dead companions. He had no cause for complaint. Then he saw that the derelict spaceport was still sliding past him with undiminished speed. He was sweeping over its outlying suburbs. Its ragged edge went by and no longer partially eclipsed the stars. In a few more minutes, it had fallen behind. His fate did not lie here, but far ahead, in the huge crimson sun, toward which the space pod was now unmistakably falling. Now, there was only the red sun, filling the sky from side to side. He was so close that its surface was no longer frozen into immobility by sheer scale. There were luminous nodules moving to and fro, cyclones of ascending and descending gas, prominences slowly rocketing toward the heavens. Slowly, they must be rising at 1,000,000 miles an hour for their movement to be visible to his eye. He did not even attempt to grasp the scale of the inferno toward which he was descending. The immensities of Saturn and Jupiter had defeated him. During Discovery's flyby in that solar system now unknown gigamiles away. But everything he saw here was 100 times larger still. He could do nothing but accept the images that were flooding into his mind without attempting to interpret them. As that sea of fire expanded behind him, Bowman should have known fear. But curiously enough, he now felt only a mild apprehension. It was not that his mind was benumbed with wonders. Logic told him that he must surely be under the protection of some controlling and almost omnipotent intelligence. He was now so close to the red sun that he would have been burned up in a moment if its radiation had not been held at bay by some invisible screen. During his voyage, he had been subjected to accelerations that should have crushed him instantly, yet he had felt nothing. If so much trouble had been taken to preserve him, there was still cause for hope. The space pod was now moving along a shallow arc almost parallel to the surface of the star, but slowly descending toward it. And now, for the first time, Bowman became aware of sounds. There was a faint, continuous roar, broken from time to time by crackles like tearing paper, or distant lightning. This could be only the feeblest echo of an unimaginable cacophony. The atmosphere surrounding him must be racked by concussions that could tear any material object to atoms. Yet he was protected from this shattering tumult as effectively as from the heat. Though ridges of flame thousands of miles high were rising and slowly collapsing around him, he was completely insulated from all this violence. The energies of the star raved past him, as if they were in another universe. The pod moved sedately through their mist, unbuffeted and unscorched. Bowman's eyes, no longer hopelessly confused by the strangeness and grandeur of the scene, began to pick out details which must have been there before, but which he had not yet perceived. The surface of this star was no formless chaos. There was pattern here, and in everything that nature created. He noticed, first, the little whirlpools of gas, probably no larger than Asia or Africa, that wandered over the surface of the star. Sometimes he could look directly down into one of them to see darker, cooler regions far below. Curiously enough, there appeared to be no sunspots. Perhaps they were a disease peculiar to the star that shone on Earth. And there were occasional clouds, like wisps of smoke blown before a gale. Perhaps they were indeed smoke, for this sun was so cold that real fire could exist here. Chemical compounds could be born and could live for a few seconds before they were again ripped apart by the fiercer nuclear violence that surrounded them. The horizon was growing brighter, its color changing from gloomy red to yellow to blue to blistering violet. The white dwarf was coming up over the horizon, dragging its tidal wave of star stuff behind it. Bowman shielded his eyes from the intolerable glare of the little sun and focused on the troubled starscape which its gravitational field was sucking skyward. Once he had seen a waterspout moving across the face of the Caribbean. This tower of flame had almost the same shape. Only the scale was slightly different, for at its base, the column was probably wider than the planet Earth. And then, immediately beneath him, Bowman noticed something which was surely new, since he could hardly have overlooked it if it had been there before. Moving across the ocean of glowing gas were myriads of bright beads. They shone with a pearly light which waxed and waned in a period of a few seconds, and they were all traveling in the same direction, like salmon moving upstream. Sometimes they weaved back and forth so that their paths intertwined, but they never touched. There were thousands of them, and the longer Bowman stared, the more convinced he became that their motion was purposeful. They were too far away from him to make out any details of their structure. That he could see them at all in this colossal panorama meant that they must be scores, perhaps hundreds of miles across. If they were organized entities, they were leviathans indeed, built to match the scale of the world they inhabited. Perhaps they were only clouds of plasma, given temporary stability by some odd combination of natural forces, like the short-lived spheres of ball lightning that still puzzled terrestrial scientists. That was an easy and perhaps soothing explanation, but as Bowman looked down upon the star-wide streaming, he could not really believe it. Those glittering nodes of light knew where they were going. They were deliberately converging upon the pillar of fire raised by the white dwarf as it orbited overhead. Bowman stared once more at that ascending column, now marching along the horizon beneath the tiny, massive star that ruled it. Could it be pure imagination, or were there patches of brighter luminosity creeping up that great geyser of gas, as if myriads of shining sparks had combined into whole continents of phosphorescence? The idea was almost beyond fantasy, but perhaps he was watching nothing less than a migration from star to star across a bridge of fire. Whether it was a movement of mindless cosmic beasts driven across space by some lemming-like urge, or a vast concourse of intelligent entities, he would probably never know. He was moving through a new order of creation, of which few men had ever dreamed. Beyond the realms of sea and land and air and space lay the realms of fire, which he alone had been privileged to glimpse. It was too much to expect that he would also understand. This is Ben, and you've been listening to Abstract Passages with Ben.